Just go to the icon at the bottom right of your Zoom panel and click the appropriate setting. Second, we'll be collecting questions from the audience as our discussion unfolds. So to send us a question, simply either use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel or tweet us to hashtag Coca Colombia. That's hashtag Coca Colombia, all one word, all lowercase. And then finally, just some history to put this current moment in some context. It's important to recall that 2021, this year, it's the 60th anniversary of the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's declaration of war on drugs. The Single Convention proposed that coca would be essentially eliminated by about 1990. And the war on drugs has privileged repressive strategies such as crop eradication in an effort to do that. But today, more coca is being cultivated than ever before, especially in Colombia. And these repressive strategies have brought bloodshed and misery along the way. Clearly, new approaches are needed, and thus today's discussion. We'll have a full hour and a half up to 12:30 to engage this discussion. So without further ado, over to you, Renata.
Thanks, John, very much. Para los colegas que nos están oyendo por YouTube o por en el seminar, si necesitan interpretación, si no entienden inglés, abajo ustedes ven un circulito donde pueden presionar. Tenemos interpretación simultánea en los dos lenguajes, así que por favor hagan eso para acompañarnos. Muchas gracias a WOLA por acompañarnos en este día hoy y organizar este seminario con nosotros en un tema que es obviamente de interés para las dos organizaciones y honradamente para todo el mundo en Colombia y aquellos que siguen el país de cerca. Un poquito sobre cómo va a funcionar este evento. Tenemos tres excelentes panelistas. Ellos son mi colega Elizabeth Dickinson, a quien le decimos Beth. Beth es nuestra analista senior para Colombia. Se llegó a Bogotá hace 2 años, después de pasar varios años en la península arábica y trabaja temas obviamente de conflicto y violencia en Colombia. Adam Isaacson es el director de Defense Oversight en WOLA. Adam has been working on defense and security issues and peace building in Latin America since 1994, and is an authority on these issues, somebody that we all have followed his work closely. I'm very grateful for his being here today. Y Pedro Arenas, nuestro colega de Viso Mutop, es uno de los cofundadores de la corporación y una de las personas que más sabe sobre la situación jurídica de los cultivadores de coca, amapola y marihuana en Colombia. Tiene estudios en ciencia política y derecho y es una de las personas que ha liderado los programas de sustitución de cultivos en Colombia desde hace muchos años. Muchas gracias a Pedro, que nos ayudó muchísimo en la producción del informe. Mil gracias por toda tu ayuda en eso y por acompañarnos hoy. So as you can see, this is going to be in Spanglish, which is our natural language for those of us in crisis groups. So the way that it's going to work is that I'm going to ask quick questions to each of the panelists. I'm going to ask them to be fairly concise and not go for over 4 minutes, and I will interrupt you if I have to, so that we can have a broad discussion and then open the conversation. We have almost over 150 participants, both through YouTube and on the Zoom, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of things to discuss, particularly in light of what has happened on this topic earlier in this week. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm just going to jump in right away, asking Beth the first question. So Beth, Colombia has dramatically expanded its fraud eradication campaign following record yield of coca in recent years. The government has argued that this would help reduce violence, particularly in the countryside, but the report finds the opposite. It says that fraud eradication policies in Colombia essentially exacerbate the violence in the countryside and is undermining the consolidation of peace. So why is that?
Well, thanks so much, and thank you again for everyone who's given their time to us this morning to discuss this topic. We really appreciate your being here with us. I think a place to start to address this question is really a little bit of context of where we are today. So I think since the peace accord, particularly what we've seen are two simultaneous trends. The first one is a dramatic increase in the amount of coca that is grown in Colombia. And the second one is an increase in specific types of violence in rural areas that have been traditionally linked to the armed conflict. So even though the national homicide rate, for example, in 2020 was actually down, rates of specific violence such as massacres, selective killings, and forced displacement have continually risen since the peace accord was signed. So we have these two trends that are simultaneous, and what the government has argued is that they are related, and it's in fact more than that, that one is causing the other, that specifically the increase in coca has exacerbated rural violence. So what we really did in this investigation was we set out to examine that thesis, to look at what is this link? Is there a link really between coca and violence? And based on that, looking at the policies that the government has implemented to address this situation, what is the link between those policies and violence and conflictivity in the countryside? So what we found is that this link between violence and coca is really not so clear. But what did really come through in the research was that the policies that have been implemented, specifically forced eradication, are linked to increases in violence and conflictivity in the countryside. And I think something that's really important to understand why this is happening is really to understand who is growing coca in Colombia today, and why this community particularly is in such a position of vulnerability. And I think that our colleague Pedro will address this, I think, later on in the conversation, but just to sort of bookmark it here, that this is a population that is extremely vulnerable, and that we need to differentiate between those who are earning the dramatic sums of money from the drug trafficking trade and those who are actually growing the raw product itself. So when we say that the forced eradication is causing violence and exacerbating conflict in the countryside, how does that manifest itself? How do we know? I think there are some clear examples and also manifestations that we can discuss. The first one is that forced eradication itself is really a violent confrontation. It's a confrontation between the state on the one hand and drug traffickers on the other hand. But the problem with this confrontation is that the farmers who actually grow the coca find themselves in the middle and without an exit strategy, without any way to find the sort of protection that they might desire. And so what forced eradication really does is forces them onto the side of traffickers. I think what this exposes that community to is, first, on the one hand, accusations of criminality and criminalization by the government, because they often, their interest is to protect their livelihood of growing coca, and because of this, bilateral confrontation, their being on the side of the traffickers is a sort of almost like an excuse to criminalize this entire community. But similarly, what happens during eradication is that it opens up this population to the vulnerability of coercion from non-state armed groups as well. You can imagine that these confrontations of forced eradication, which I think, again, we'll discuss in a little bit more depth later, are very ripe for exploitation. And that's exactly what happens, that this farming community, this smallhold farming community, is really sort of in the center and manipulated by both sides. A second form of violence that we can see that's very clear from forced eradication is the acute humanitarian crisis that it can spark in its aftermath. So we have an immediate loss of income in communities where eradication takes place, and that can lead to things such as forced displacement, pressure perhaps to replant one thing or another, and really just an acute social tension. All of this culminates in really a hostile relationship between the rural communities and the state. And this is how we come to the conclusion that essentially what's happening with forced eradication in the countryside is that it is undermining the state's ability to consolidate their legitimacy, their influence, and ultimately their control in the countryside. So one of the core tenets of the peace accord was exactly that, for the state to establish services, legitimacy, this presence, so to speak, that isn't just military, but actually has a depth and something that rural communities can believe in and start to be a part of. And what eradication then does is essentially makes that impossible. First, because of this hostile relationship with the communities, but second of all, instead of providing these rural areas with the protection that they seek, it essentially forces them on the side of traffickers and expels them from that same state and that same protection that they would need in order to really integrate into the state and be able to consolidate it. So we have two goals that are in conflict here. We have the counter-drug policy, and we have the idea of the state establishing really a credible, legitimate presence in the countryside, and we find that they are directly in conflict.
Thank you so much, Beth. Before I turn to Adam, para la gente que nos está oyendo en YouTube, YouTube no tiene la posibilidad de hacer la traducción simultánea. Si necesitan oír en alguno de los otros dos idiomas, por favor vayan al link de Zoom. Lo encuentran en la página de WOLA, también lo encuentran en Twitter, donde lo hemos estado publicitando. Entonces, si necesitan traducción, por favor vayan a Zoom. Les toca registrarse, pero se demora 1 minuto y pueden entrar inmediatamente. Sorry, Adam, that was an important piece of
yes,
housekeeping for those of us who are not bilingual. Adam, so turning to you, the U.S. has historically pushed Colombia to eradicate. The Trump administration did it very much. This last week, apparently, the Biden administration kept on that same line, but it has also invested huge amounts of money in supporting the peace agreement. How would the U.S. government, what would they say about this conclusion that Beth just explained, that the drug policy is actually undermining the goal of consolidated peace?
Good question. And it was a year ago, more or less this week, when the last time Donald Trump met Iván Duque, the president of Colombia, and sort of wagged his finger at him and said, "You're going to have to spray." But I think Trump was a bit of an outlier on this. I think there is more nuance, and most of the responses you would get if you asked U.S. officials about the fact that they've supported the peace process, but they also have supported eradication. But I feel like, I'm going to be putting words in the mouths of U.S. officials here. It's not like I'm in touch with U.S. officials very often, but it's not like we go out to drinks and have dinner parties together. So it's often quite, not exactly candid when we have these exchanges. So taking that into account, I would say, you probably hear maybe 3 different attitudes on this. I mean, some officials, will come right at you out of 1987. Like, these farmers are breaking the law. They're tools of narco traffickers. They're out for an easy buck. Too bad. They're growing this out in the open. We can find it easily, so they're going to get what's coming to them. You will still hear that, not as often, but it's there. A few will focus more on the criminal networks, especially people like in DEA or that entorno, that environment. They'll say, we should be putting a lot more emphasis on financial flows, on the sophisticated organized crime networks, breaking up the kingpins. So go ahead and eradicate, they might say, but these networks are still going to be there, and they're still going to offer good money to whoever is willing to grow. Other U.S. officials, people who maybe have more of a counterinsurgency or a development background, will say, this is a problem of ungoverned spaces. They'll actually repeat a lot of the themes in the crisis group report. They'll say, Colombia needs to exercise sovereignty over its territory. Often they will say, let's bring in the security forces, and then let's bring in the civilian part of the government after that, once you've established security conditions, and then start offering services to these people. That's something we've heard since really at least the mid-2000s. The folks who have that view will probably not be opposed to forced eradication necessarily, but they'll say we should eradicate, but we also need the population to want the government in their territory, that state legitimacy that Elizabeth was just talking about. So they might say, we shouldn't overdo eradication, and it shouldn't outpace the entry of the state and the provision of services. I would say a subset of this group, which may be the largest group actually among officials, a subset of that group would say that the peace accord offers a way to deal with these ungoverned spaces. Some officials in this category might be uncomfortable with the idea of forced eradication, especially when it's not accompanied by government presence or services. But of course, that's happening right now massively, even in the midst of a pandemic, and you don't hear a lot of people speaking out against it inside the executive branch. So you got this wide range of points of view, but I don't think you'll find many officials who will say openly, we have to stop doing forced eradication. Maybe if you get a couple of drinks in them at a bar, they'll say it openly, but I've never heard it. The response would more likely be, this is one of our tools, and we would never want to give up one of our tools. So, it's been, frankly, a long time since the United States government has sort of stopped and said, hold it, What are we doing here? Does all of this make sense? What has to change? And then actually somebody in leadership with decision-making and resource allocating power actually realigns the policy. Without that leadership, you get this sort of balkanized situation. The DEA would rather you never cut back on kingpin operations. The Southcom would never want to cut back on maritime interdiction. State INL would never want to cut back on forced eradication. All of them would argue, what I'm doing is an essential tool. You never give up a tool in your toolbox. And that's where you need leadership. That's where you do need somebody to come in and say, this isn't working anymore. This is out of date. We have to do this instead. This isn't being used enough and we have to do that. And, you know, is that leadership going to come in the Biden administration? I believe we're going to save that for later in the discussion.
Thanks so much, Adam. I'm afraid that we might have lost Pedro. Ah, no, míralo, ahí está, estaba escondido. Pedro, quería preguntarte, tú que conoces tan bien la situación en el campo y sobre todo en los lugares donde se está cultivando coca, para la gente que no está familiarizada con el tema, danos como una especie de escenario de cómo funciona esto en Colombia. ¿Cuántas familias cultivan coca? ¿Por qué deciden hacer esto? Para las familias que lo están haciendo, ¿cuáles son los mayores riesgos de seguridad? Este informe que produjimos nosotros obviamente habla sobre la necesidad de hacer políticas de drogas más eficaces, pero nos interesa sobre todo el tema de seguridad y cómo afecta la coca, la violencia que hay en el campo. ¿Cómo ves tú esta perspectiva desde el campo?
Hola Renata, buenos días para todos y todas. Muchas gracias por la invitación y por el excelente trabajo del International Crisis Group y de WOLA. Para nosotros es un gusto poder participar en este panel. En Colombia aproximadamente el 20% del total de las poblaciones rurales está vinculada con cultivos de uso ilícito. Eso es un número bastante importante, toda vez que ha habido un descenso, una quiebra de buena parte de las agriculturas legales en nuestro país. Según varios reportes, estamos importando una cantidad superior al 30% del total de los alimentos que se consumen en este país. Y esto es debido a las políticas de libre comercio que se han aplicado desde los años 90. Buena parte de las agriculturas que se empleaban en departamentos como el Valle, Cauca, Nariño, Antioquia, que antes se dedicaban fundamentalmente a la producción de alimentos, pues han quebrado y muchas familias han migrado a los cultivos de uso ilícito, particularmente la hoja de coca para pasta base. La hoja de coca para pasta base tiene muchas ventajas si se le mira como una agricultura más respecto de las otras. La hoja de coca se produce más o menos cada 2 meses en este país, es decir, tiene unas 6 cosechas al año. Ningún otro cultivo otorga esa cantidad de cosechas. Adicionalmente, la hoja de coca tiene, aunque es ilegal, unas condiciones de competitividad mejores a las de otros productos agrícolas. Por ejemplo, la pasta base de coca se compra en la finca directamente y muchas personas tienen tan solo que llevar pequeñas cantidades de peso en sus hombros o en su mochila para salir al poblado más cercano a venderla, lo cual no ocurre con otros productos en zonas donde además no hay carreteras o no hay buenas infraestructuras de transporte. La hoja de coca para pasta base tiene un mercado asegurado. Toda la pasta base que se produce en nuestro país se vende. Es un producto no perecedero, no se daña con el tiempo o con la humedad, se puede guardar durante largos periodos y entonces tiene esas ventajas que visto como una agricultura, insisto en ello, pues la hace más competitiva respecto de las otras que están en crisis, incluyendo dentro de esas economías en crisis también al café y en algunos casos al cacao, porque se trata en buena medida de un país que no protege a sus agricultores legales. ¿Qué les lleva a dedicarse a esta actividad? Pues el hecho de que se combinan estas ventajas competitivas con que muchas familias están ubicadas en lugares donde no hay infraestructuras, donde no llega el Estado a proveer servicios o dotaciones básicas y donde además el Estado ha perdido desde hace décadas el control del territorio por parte de sus fuerzas de seguridad. Como se trata de un mercado ilícito, grupos armados ilegales se disputan esas rentas. Como bien lo plantean ustedes en su informe, esos grupos armados, al tiempo que representan un riesgo de seguridad, curiosa y paradójicamente también representan una especie de protección a las transacciones comerciales que se adelantan con la pasta base. Entonces hay una especie de precio de sustentación garantizado en aquellas zonas y ese precio de sustentación está mediado por intervenciones de actores armados ilegales. Claro que hay riesgos de violencia, sí. Sin embargo, una serie de estudios han demostrado que no siempre las altas tasas de homicidios coinciden con los departamentos o municipios donde hay más cultivos de coca. Sin embargo, esa es una gran preocupación. Pero ¿qué les preocupa también a quienes cultivan coca? Las respuestas estatales. Dentro de esas respuestas estatales está el uso de la fuerza por parte del Estado. Cientos o miles de familias han pedido desde los años 80 que llegue el Estado con oportunidades para acceder a mercados lícitos, con infraestructuras, pero también que llegue todo el conjunto del Estado Social de Derecho y no solamente algunos operativos militares cada año. Curiosamente, los operativos militares siguen siendo la única presencia del Estado en buena parte de los 14 departamentos con mayores niveles de producción. Y esos operativos estatales emplean drásticamente la fuerza, la violencia. Incluso las fuerzas militares están cada vez más implicadas en tareas de erradicación forzada y no siempre los soldados o los militares han recibido entrenamiento para, por ejemplo, enfrentar las protestas sociales. Para eso está la Policía Nacional. Pero los militares en el terreno se enfrentan a la población campesina que protesta contra la erradicación y que al tiempo reclama la sustitución voluntaria o los programas de apoyo a sus agriculturas lícitas. Y ahí, en esos choques, lleva la peor parte, la mayor de las veces, la comunidad, que pone muertos, heridos, que se desplaza y en donde el Estado no gana para nada en legitimidad, como bien dice su informe, sino que por el contrario acrecienta la desconfianza de las comunidades hacia las instituciones.
Mil gracias, Pedro. Muy importante ese diagnóstico. And Beth, let me allow to just build on exactly what Pedro was describing, because that is something that you wrote about extensively in the report. The way in which coca growers are sort of caught between the state security forces and the criminal organizations. You were able to do field in a year in which most of us haven't been able to leave the house. You were lucky to go to many of these places. What did you see when you went there? How is the situation on the ground?
Yeah, so I think perhaps one thing that could be helpful is I want to describe a little bit about what kind of eradication we're talking about, what these operations actually look like. And that can help understand exactly why this is a confrontational strategy and exactly the dynamics that Pedro was mentioning. So what we're discussing right now is manual eradication. So what that essentially means is that the military and the police are going into these areas and physically pulling up the coca crops or spraying them with pesticides at close range. So generally what's happening is that the military will enter an area. Of course, they'll be carrying their arms and they will secure the area and the perimeter of the area. So this just visually, you can imagine that this is what sort of image this is conveying in a rural area whose only experience really with the Colombian state are these sorts of operations and this sort of presence of the military. So another important thing I think to understand, and we were very lucky in this report to have the opportunity not only to speak to communities, but also with the military. And I think something that has become very clear is that because the military has very high targets and specific targets about how much they must eradicate each month and each year, they are really searching for those hectares. They are really searching for those places. So something that's happened over the 20 years that we've been seeking to eradicate coca, fumigation and forced eradication manually, is that the coca has moved. The coca has moved to places that are off limits for eradication. So we're discussing national parks, we're talking about indigenous reserves, areas that the military simply can't reach. So the large majority of the very significant plots that we can say are sort of large growers are in these protected areas. So when the military has to find, if I'm the commander in a given department, I have to find 8,000 hectares to eradicate, the majority of those hectares are probably protected. So I have to go to the sort of edges of the territory to find places to eradicate. And often that means going to the places that have the smallhold farmers that are sort of in the most vulnerable situations, that don't have access to transportation networks and have the least sort of presence, so to speak, of state services. So that's sort of the context in which this is happening. So we imagine that the military arrives to a community. What does the community do in response? There are a series of strategies that we try to outline in the report, and I think they're divided. We can divide them sort of into two categories. One of them is sort of an individual strategy, and one is an organized strategy. Individuals who are facing eradication might simply flee the area. out of fear of arrest or being, being caught cultivating coca, which is a legal offense. Or there are approaches that are based on community organization. And because the military is showing up with such a presence, this is really, I think, what communities have established as their best resistance, right? Is to organize amongst themselves and to protest, often peacefully, in sort of in direct confrontation with the military. So you'll see you can find easily on YouTube videos of the military right here and the campesinos right here, and then they're face to face. It's a very visceral confrontation. In some cases, that the community will try to negotiate with the military. So, for example, they'll say, "Why don't you eradicate this portion of our crop and leave the rest of this for sustenance?" The military wins because they get to check the whole area eradicated. The community wins in a sense because they get to protect at least some level of their cultivation, and also might secure other concessions. For example, the expulsion of the military, which we've seen on a number of occasions during the pandemic, that there's such hostility toward the military that after an eradication operation, the community simply says to the military, "You're not welcome here." And often the military respects that because they're also interested in their own safety and their ability to carry out operations. The other scenario for organized resistance are direct clashes. And in 2020, there were over 1,800 of those that left 16 people dead and over 100 wounded. So this is not a small number of incidents. Obviously, these clashes are bad for everyone. They're, of course, bad for the military because it's not nice to be a soldier. Many of these guys are young and be in direct confrontation with women, children, farmers that you can easily imagine came from communities like theirs. But it's particularly bad for the coca farmers because it places them in this situation that is extremely ripe for exploitation. So if there's a disposition in the area to protest regardless, we can imagine that just a slight nudge or slight bit of coercion from an armed actor, who's often the only de facto authority in these areas, can really make this a matter of life or death. You show up to the protest, or you go forward, or your women and children will be on the front line, and they don't, the threat doesn't have to be explicit. It's there because the presence of these armed actors is in the territory. So this is, again, what does this mean? This means that the farmers have no exit from this conflict. They are literally stuck in the middle, and there is no good option for them.
Thanks, Beth. Quite vivid and worrisome description there. Adam, let me turn to you on a question of how these efforts to eradicate coca have been framed historically and currently, between especially the relationship between the US and Colombia, because a lot of these narcotic strategies had been framed as counterinsurgency efforts in the past, right? Obviously now, after the peace agreement with the FARC, the situation is fairly different. We have only one guerrilla, the ELN, but there's a multiplicity of other criminal groups, which the report describes in certain length. So how are the US and the Colombian government seeing the connection between coca growth and cocaine production and the remaining guerrilla groups and criminal groups on the ground? Is there still that counterinsurgency mentality? And do you think that their approach is correct, or how should we be thinking about this now?
Thank you, Renata. I'm going to do my best to answer this one in 4 minutes. I think that I'm not sure that the U.S. government and the Colombian government are reading off the same, song sheet here on counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency right now. As your deeply rooted report notes, officials in the Duque administration, including President Duque, have said several times that coca is the cause of Colombia's current violence. They have even said that the best way to stop the killings of social leaders is to fumigate. I think that's really simplistic. I don't think a lot of US officials share that simplistic of a view. I mean, and anybody who knows Colombia knows it wasn't great to be a social leader in Colombia before coca. During La Violencia in the 1950s, there wasn't coca, and they were killing campesino leaders like crazy. Even now, a place like Arauca has almost no coca, some transshipment, but yeah, I mean, even San Diego, California has transshipment, and it is one of the most violent places in the country. I think most US officials realize that the problem is more complex. I dare say that most US officials would probably agree if you said that the real problem here, again, is the absence of the state and widespread impunity in peripheral zones, just as your report points out very well. I think that, a lot of US officials went through this experience with Plan Colombia, where when Plan Colombia began in the early 2000s, the argument was we're going to take financing away from the guerrillas by expanding fumigation. They expanded fumigation, and as we've noted, Coca reduced only somewhat. The guerrillas got hit harder by other aspects of Plan Colombia, particularly aerial bombings, and later on efforts to bring state presence into some areas. I think a key defining moment for a lot of US officials, particularly at Southcom, USAID, its Office of Transition Initiatives, to some extent at INL, people have really stayed on working on Colombia over the years. Were very influenced by the experience of the so-called National Territorial Consolidation Plan, which was an effort that Colombia carried out in the late 2000s into the early 2010s, picking out a few municipalities where they brought in military, started military, and then in a phased way, at least on PowerPoint, the plan was to bring in the rest of the state. It achieved some results, this consolidation plan, in the Macarena region, not far from Guaviare, where Pedro is from. But ultimately, it sort of faded away. And it was a lot of investment, and the Santos government didn't really continue it, in part because Sergio Jaramillo, who ran it, went to Cuba to go negotiate with the FARC, and it's often a question of leadership. But I think that model really stuck in a lot of the minds of officials in the United States, and it's something that they would prefer to do. But I'll be a little cynical here. And again, I'm imputing an attitude that I'd never actually heard a US official say out loud, but put yourself in the point of view of a US official who wants to support something like this, a long-term Colombian program, hopefully civilian, that gets state presence into these ungoverned territories where there's all the violent armed groups in Coca. Like something like the PDETs, the development programs of the territorial focus that are foreseen in the peace accord, or even that militarized subset, the Zonas Futuro, that the current Colombian government is pursuing, and that appears in your report. To do that, to do a big ambitious program like that, Colombia will need to put up a lot of its own resources. The United States can only help pay for this on the margins. Also, Colombia will have to bring in the justice system, because it's not just creating state presence, it's actually doing so without impunity. There's places in Colombia where we have state presence, but where organized crime thrives. Guerrillas tend not to thrive, but organized crime thrives, which is why, hang on, I have to there. Sorry, I lost contact there. I had a little technical difficulty. So organized crime thrives in a lot of these areas, even though there is state presence, because there's impunity. To some extent, the FARC were easy to fight because they wanted to fight the state. Organized crime and a lot of these new groups that have popped up do not. They're losing if they have to fight the state. They penetrate the state. They use plata o plomo to take over and keep officials from pursuing them. So simply bringing in the state with full impunity could do more harm than good. Okay, doing all of this means people running Colombia have to put up a lot of resources, and they have to submit to the rule of law, even their most corrupt officials. You know, you collaborate with paramilitaries, you go to jail. Okay, so back to this US official. Do you see the Duque government really committed to those two things I just mentioned? Do you see any energy for a Marshall Plan in rural areas? You know, Emilio Archila, the counselor for stabilization, is overseeing some interesting things, but certainly nothing on that scale. Hardly. So here's the cynical part. You know what needs to be done. You see little likelihood that Colombia's political class is going to do it anytime soon. Meanwhile, you're under pressure from Washington to reduce cocaine supplies. Forced eradication, fumigation might look kind of good to you as a stopgap to keep the problem manageable without actually moving towards solving it. I know that's cynical, but you know, I'll end with this. And in my other hat, I often work on the US-Mexico border. And there we see huge increases in asylum seekers from Central America, because there's a broken asylum system in the United States, and you know, there's horrible conditions in Central America. Has the policy been, let's help Central America deal with root causes and let's fix our asylum system? No, it's been, let's block asylum seekers. It's quicker, it keeps the numbers down, it keeps it manageable. And you know, I just feel like I'm dealing with this same, this same lazy shortcut that ends up doing more harm in everything I work on here at WOLA lately, if I may vent for a moment.
Gracias, Adam. Sí, esa cuestión del corto plazo y del largo plazo quizás es la la maldición que lleva a Colombia, y Francisco Tumbi, que está en la audiencia, está haciendo comentarios de ese estilo en el Q&A, diciendo cómo hacemos para romper estos dos, pero ya llegaremos a esa pregunta. Pero Pedro, muy conectado con lo que hemos estado conversando hasta ahora, el programa, el acuerdo de paz y creó un programa de sustitución voluntaria, un mapa, digamos, de alguna manera, para tratar de hacer ese desarrollo rural a largo plazo, del que claramente hay un diagnóstico que es lo que se necesita para resolver este problema a largo plazo. Pero lo que está pasando en el terreno, según vemos, es bastante diferente. ¿Por qué no nos explicas un poquito qué se prometió, qué está ocurriendo, cuál es el problema y cómo lo solucionamos en 4 minutos? Súper fácil.
Bien, claramente Colombia ha tenido experiencias en materia de sustitución de cultivos y proyectos de desarrollo alternativo desde comienzos de los años 90, junto con algunas zonas de Perú y de Bolivia en los Andes. Colombia ha desarrollado de la mano con la asistencia técnica de la UNODC y también por iniciativa de los presidentes algunos programas de sustitución, y tenemos buenas lecciones aprendidas de familias guardabosques, del Plan Nacional de Desarrollo Alternativo Plante, también del mismo programa de consolidación. Lo que ha ocurrido es que las lecciones interesantes no se han copiado y no se le ha dado continuidad a los programas, Renata. Cada presidente se ha inventado un programa diferente, entonces no gozamos de una estabilidad institucional para estos programas. Sustitución de cultivos es como una contracara de la erradicación forzada. Es una estrategia pacífica, dialogada, implica proyectos productivos, implica una mejor presencia institucional de carácter social en los territorios. Pero también complementa paradójicamente a erradicación, porque ambas pretenden la eliminación de hectáreas. Y entonces se ha puesto a los programas de sustitución a competir con erradicación forzada para ver qué tan exitoso es cada uno, en cuál elimina más hectáreas al año. Este fue un problema que tuvo la administración Santos incluso en el comienzo del programa PENIS. Se puso a competir a un programa que no tenía un buen equipo burocrático, que no tenía tampoco presupuesto suficiente, con el Ministerio de Defensa, que hacía erradicación forzada, y a ambos se les puso la meta de erradicar 50.000 hectáreas. Pues no se puede poner a competir a los programas de sustitución con los programas de erradicación. Eso debería ser una lección clara para todos y todas. Segundo, no deberíamos medir para nada el éxito de los programas de sustitución en cuántas hectáreas elimina y cuánta plata se le asigna al programa. Se debería medir es en cuánto grado de desarrollo se provee a esos territorios, en cuántas oportunidades de vincularse con economías lícitas tienen las familias campesinas de esos lugares, en cuántas infraestructuras se construyeron. Es decir, una nueva métrica debería estar detrás de los programas de sustitución, desde un enfoque de acceso al desarrollo y de derechos humanos, y no en cuántas hectáreas se eliminan. Se ha dicho, por ejemplo, que el programa PENIS es muy costoso, y se compara siempre con las medidas cortoplacistas de la erradicación terrestre o de las fumigaciones aéreas. Ahora mismo se pretende vender como una fórmula exitosa la aspersión aérea, porque podría llegar a eliminar al año 50, 60.000 hectáreas, pero esos son resultados de corto plazo. La sustitución de cultivos es más lenta, pero brinda resultados más estables en el tiempo. Yo conozco personalmente, fui alcalde de San José del Guaviare, familias que estuvieron en guardabosques que definitivamente cuando se vincularon a ese programa dejaron atrás para siempre los cultivos de uso ilícito, mientras que eso no ocurrió con las aspersiones aéreas. Las aspersiones trasladan los cultivos de un lugar para otro. En ese sentido, las aspersiones aéreas y el uso de la fuerza en la erradicación terrestre es más costoso. Por plata, es más costoso en términos ambientales, y es más costoso en cuanto a ilegitimidad de las instituciones ante los ojos de las comunidades. Respecto del programa de sustitución desprendido del Acuerdo de Paz de 2016, llamado PENIS, Programa Nacional Integral de Sustitución de Cultivos, se vincularon unas 100.000 familias, Renata, en ese panorama que quieres que presente. De esas familias, no todas han recibido asistencia técnica y no todas han recibido proyectos de seguridad alimentaria, pero ha habido un avance importante. Sin embargo, lo que más le interesa a las comunidades que se vincularon son los recursos para emprender proyectos productivos alternativos. Y hoy, 3 años y medio después de que las familias que primero se vincularon arrancaron unas 43.000 hectáreas de coca, solo el 2% del total de los vinculados a ese programa ha llegado a obtener recursos para proyectos productivos por cuenta del Estado colombiano, el 2%. Eso es un número realmente ínfimo pasados ya casi 4 años. Y eso es lo que hace que muchos piensen que el PENIS no es exitoso, que el PENIS no funciona. Realmente el PENIS no puede todavía decir uno si funciona o no funciona, porque lo que pasa es que no lo hemos hecho bien y no lo hemos aplicado correctamente y de manera oportuna. Y quisiera cerrar diciendo, respecto a los programas de sustitución, en tus preguntas, ¿qué debería hacer la comunidad internacional? Pues bien, la comunidad internacional debería dejar de apostar por medidas cortoplacistas como la erradicación terrestre y la aspersión aérea, debería concentrarse más en respaldar esfuerzos de desarrollo. El punto 4 del Acuerdo de Paz de 2016 tenía que estar atado al punto 1 del Acuerdo de Paz, y no puede haber sustitución de cultivos sin programas de acceso a la tierra. No puede haber programas de sustitución de cultivos sin programas serios de acceso a mercados lícitos, sin construcción de infraestructuras. Sin duda, si la cooperación internacional se enfoca en respaldar este tipo de esfuerzos, habría mejores resultados en el tiempo desde todo punto de vista social, económico y ambiental.
Gracias, Pedro. Muy útil. Beth, I'm going to turn to you with a question that I'm just reading the Q&A, and this is something that is coming up in many of the questions that are being posed by the audience, which is, what are the implications of drug policy in the government security strategy in the countryside, and in particular for the future of the 2016 peace accords? You had mentioned earlier today that you had done quite a few interviews with the military. What are the eradication units and the regional commanders think about this? What would you recommend to alternatives? Several of the people who are listening today are asking, okay, how is this violence connected with other criminal economies? What's happening with other criminal groups? If Coca is not at the center, then how does it connect when we think about a strategy that helps bring insecurity down in the countryside? And I know that's a very big question.
As usual, 4 minutes to solve everything. Look, I want to start by saying something that I think has come up a lot in our discussion, but we need to just clarify a little bit. There's a lot of discussion when we talk about these issues about state presence. And for me, the question is not state presence, it's what kind of state presence. Because it's not that you go into these areas and there is no state presence. It's a question of what kind of state do you have there. Is it the state that's only the military? Is it the state that's co-opted by whatever criminal or armed group is in the area? Is it a state that's extractive, or is it a state that's providing actual services? And this is actually a similar debate to what we see when we discuss with communities about military presence. Communities in rural areas want security. They just don't want the military. So what that tells us is not that they don't want a military, it's that they want a military that behaves differently, that has different objectives, and that provides security for them. So this leads us into a discussion about the security strategy at the moment. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about what we heard from the military about how they feel about eradication. So I don't in any way mean to speak for that institution, but the individuals who we spoke with, and including senior officials, expressed a number of frustrations that I think are interesting and useful to hear. I think the first frustration is generally that eradication complicates their job. So eradication is not a job that anyone enjoys. It's not enjoyable for those who are experiencing eradication, and it's certainly not enjoyable for those who are eradicating. And the military is very frustrated by the temporary nature of eradication. So we have one of these big operations, very confrontational, very hard work, taxing, distressing work for soldiers, and then they leave. They can't secure that area because they don't have the troops. And so within 3-4 months, that same area, much of it will be replanted with Coca. So the military actually has one of the higher estimates of replanting that we heard. UNODC puts it at 50%, the military puts it between 85 and 90% for manual eradication, which means that you eradicate 100 hectares and only 9 of them will remain without Coca. A second, I think, frustration is really that these sorts of operations are a distraction from the sorts of operations that they would like to be prioritizing in terms of disarticulating armed groups. So in areas where there's significant amounts of eradication taking place, this can take away 1/3 to or more of the troops that are in the area from other jobs. And I think another complaint that's really quite important to hear is that it complicates the job of security in terms of building trust with the community, which in this context is vital, because you need human intelligence if you're going to disarticulate these organizations. You need trust. You need to be able to have a relationship where there's information sharing. And that's impossible in areas where eradication is taking place, because the risks of any interaction with the military are just enormous. And in fact, the military unintentionally, I think in many cases, put civilians at risk by requesting information. So this is sort of a very difficult, this is a difficult puzzle for them to sort through. I think what this all brings us to is sort of this picture where you have the military in almost perpetual conflict with the countryside in order to keep the number of hectares down, right? If it's so temporary and if it's so confrontational and if there's so little trust with the community, it's just going to require that you keep doing it constantly, always. And that's really not a goal that that's not something it's not compatible with the idea of securing the countryside, with providing civilians a place where they can sort of safely go about their lives. So what do we suggest, I think, in it as a way to sort of flip the script? I think the first sort of governing rule that we put forward in the report and that we would argue is sort of the base of the thinking about this is we have to give cultivators a safe way out. We have to provide them a way to have security in their communities and to have an option. Because again, right now, the confrontational situation that they're facing does not provide an option out of the current situation that they're in. And what that looks like, again, is probably turning back a bit the coercive approaches, rolling back eradication. We're pragmatists in Crisis Group. I think no one expects that forced eradication is going to stop tomorrow, but if we can't stop it tomorrow, let's start to limit it. Let's look for ways that we can negotiate with communities, that we can do gradual eradication that is voluntary, that is in agreement with the community, that is in exchange for some sort of support. And when there is eradication, what we strongly suggest is that the military is not at the forefront of it, because this is just such a poisonous, toxic relationship that's been developed between the state security forces who are meant to be protecting these communities and the way that they are being asked to behave in the territory. It's not compatible with a sort of policing or security model in which you can say that the community feels safe. So again, I think, last point would be that for the US, the question is really the following. We have this drug policy that is, again, aimed at sort of these short-term wins of reducing hectares, and they're leaving behind this legacy of damage that is really undermining the ability for us to consolidate the rural areas on a long-term basis. So if these goals are in enormous conflict, we need to decide which one is more important. And if they're both very important, we need to make sure that the way that we're pursuing them is not the right hand is undermining what the left hand is doing.
Thanks, Beth. Super important policy coherence point there, and maybe this is a good moment to turn to Adam on this particular question, because obviously the pressure of the U.S. on both pushing the two policies that sometimes contradict each other is giant. So before we end and open to the questions, I have to ask you the requisite question about, so Biden is now in power. Is anything going to change? How do you read the certification that came earlier in the week, and the sort of, a lot of people in Colombia were, oh my God, we thought this was going to be the change. What happened? He said exactly the same. How are you seeing this in the 4 years to come?
I'm going to give the most optimistic possible view. I think that we're not going to see change right away. How's that for optimistic? There is obviously a zombie factor here. We don't have our political appointees in place yet. You have either career officials or people from the last administration still writing these reports and putting the language out. And of course, even among those who may, be change-minded, there's a lot of sunk costs in the eradication infrastructure. So, you've certainly, I'm going to hope that the language we saw in the March 1st International Narcotics Control Strategy Report and the February 23rd required by Congress certification that Colombia has an eradication strategy, that language, highlighted that Colombia is pursuing a restart of the fumigation program as a sign of progress. that was concerning. I'm going to hope that that was zombie language bearing no relationship or no resemblance to obviously the language that we saw in the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission report that came out late last year. That was a bipartisan government commission, an executive branch commission that included some commissioners who are close to or are actually now inside the Biden administration. And it said pretty clearly that fumigation in particular and forced eradication without assistance can be self-defeating policies. But of course, we haven't seen that yet in any real statements from the Biden administration. Yeah, I've had some conversations with colleagues in Colombia saying, hey, wait a minute, what is this? We thought that the Biden administration was opposed to fumigation. I would challenge them to find a Biden administration official in the past or now ever going on record saying they were against fumigation. They have been, if anything, silent on the subject. And of course, Joe Biden in the year 2000, when he was a senator and the Plan Colombia aid package was going through Congress, was pretty vocally in favor of expanding fumigation. He may have changed. That's been 21 years. But okay, the political, none of that was optimistic. The political appointees are going to come, hopefully by mid-year. You know, who's going to be the drug czar? Who's going to be the assistant secretary for narcotics and law enforcement? Who's going to be the assistant secretary for Western Hemisphere affairs? Who's going to be at DOD, Defense Department Counter Narcotics, in the office of Secretary Austin? I mean, are they going to be caretakers, or are at least some of them going to be people interested in reform? At this point, I'll be as optimistic as I can. I would really like to see a fundamental policy review happen in late 2021, early 2022, just as usually it's the fall of 2021 is when the executive branch folks will be sitting together and deciding what they want to ask Congress for 2023, which would then get debated in Congress all of next year, 2022. That's the perfect time. Just as Colombia is seeing the virus subside and going into their presidential campaign mode, they have elections in March of 2022. So I think the end of this year, beginning of next year could be a super interesting time. And going into 2022, you're gonna have a new government in Colombia. The Biden administration will finally be quite consolidated in pursuing an agenda. You'll have a new budget process for 2023 with, the current configuration in Congress will remain where like the old school hardliners are going to be somewhat sidelined and marginalized. And people who have been more skeptical, like Senator Leahy, Congressman McGovern, and many others will have more power than they really have in the past. Some of the moderates who've backed forced eradication in the past, like Bob Menendez or Dianne Feinstein, they're going to have to be engaged on this, but I think they can be open to better approaches. So this is a really important time, really starting middle of this year into the middle of next year to really get this rethinking. And so I hope that, we will continue to work together on this. And I just have to underline that the deeply rooted report is just a huge input at this point as we try to socialize this. So thank you.
Thanks, Adam, for that. Lo que he hecho es que he reunido varias de las preguntas que están en el Q&A. Voy a mandárselas al panel y también a John y a Ivan, porque tengo un par que creo que ustedes están en mejor posición para responder. Hay algunas que están dirigidas específicamente a Pedro, pero las voy a hacer y todos siéntanse en libertad de contestar si les parece. Hay varias preguntas sobre presencia estatal y exactamente qué quiere decir eso, qué se necesita en el campo. Y Francisco Tumi, que fue una de las personas que hizo esa pregunta, apunta a algo que nosotros encontramos en muchas de las conversaciones que tuvimos con los oficiales del gobierno colombiano. Y es un poquito el hecho de que habría que cargar fiscalmente a las ciudades bastante para poder darle al campo lo que se necesita, y realmente nosotros no vimos una voluntad política muy grande en eso. En el informe escribimos, porque varias personas nos dijeron esencialmente lo que hay que hacer es que hay que mover a los campesinos al Estado, porque realmente vamos a llegar con el Estado a donde están los campesinos es bastante improbable. Entonces, Pedro, sobre todo porque tú fuiste alcalde de San José de Guaviare, has estado en posiciones. ¿Cómo se coordina además ese nivel nacional con el nivel local y qué exactamente se necesita en términos de construcción de Estado? También quería, espérame, hago todas las preguntas y después les devuelvo la palabra, si te parece. Hay una pregunta también sobre la polarización política que existe en Colombia en este momento y en qué medida eso puede estar aumentando la violencia. Obviamente, ya hemos discutido bastante sobre la presencia de grupos criminales, etcétera, pero qué tanto, digamos, esa polarización que existe, aunque sé que hay Francisco Gutiérrez, si nos está viendo, se va a poner furioso porque insiste que no hay polarización, pero digamos, ese ánimo un poco más caldeado en términos de polarización política, eso ha tenido alguna influencia o no en esta violencia alrededor de la coca. Estefanía Restrepo nos pregunta si podemos darle ejemplos concretos donde hay, no siempre donde hay más coca, hay violencia. Creo que no podemos en este momento responderte exactamente con datos, pero en el informe, eso no es algo que vemos en mucho detalle, pero sí tenemos, creo que es el pie de página número 10, si me acuerdo bien. Juan Carlos Garzón en el Fundación Ideas para la Paz, Razón Pública, han hecho exámenes en el que, como Pedro decía, muestran que no son, la correlación no es exacta. O sea, que hay gente que ha hecho esa examinación y con gusto, si quieres, después te podemos señalar en esas pruebas. Para Ivan, they're asking me, so what should be the role of the international community besides the US, right? What should be the EU saying? What should be OAS saying? What should other Latin American governments be saying about this question? And John, I think perhaps you are better sort of to answer this question. They're also asking, would it make sense to try to reduce consumption in consumption countries, if that is a distinction that we still make at this point? Is it the problem of trying to just cut over something that is not working? So for more from like a drug policy perspective, what would you say to that? Pedro, ¿por qué no empezamos contigo?
¿Cómo quieres que comience?
Dale, sí, dale tú, por favor, contesta.
Ok, muchas gracias al profesor Tumi y a todas las personas que nos están viendo y que además han hecho llegar preguntas. Miren, en las comunidades a las cuales nos estamos refiriendo, las demandas podrían señalarse en su siguiente orden. Primero, servicios básicos como la educación, la salud, la provisión de infraestructuras, particularmente las carreteras secundarias y terciarias, están siempre en el corazón de los pedidos de las comunidades. Igualmente, la protección de sus agriculturas. Muchos y muchas reclaman que sus productos agrícolas lícitos tengan seguro de cosechas, que tengan precios de sustentación, apoyo para el transporte y para el bodegaje, y que reciban también asistencia técnica para poder insertarse de manera adecuada en los mercados nacionales e internacionales, cumpliendo todos los estándares sanitarios y fitosanitarios. Para eso, pues, hay que fortalecer la prestación de los servicios técnicos asistenciales en todos los órdenes. En el campo productivo, pues, fortalecer las unidades que prestan servicios de asistencia técnica como las UMATAS y las Secretarías de Agricultura. El profesor Tumi se refiere a la presencia del Estado. Yo tendría que decir que tenemos Estado prácticamente en todos los territorios del país, pero no necesariamente el Estado que las comunidades demandan, que las comunidades requieren. Le vuelvo a colocar de ejemplo el caso de Guaviare. Hay una brigada militar, hay unidades militares de todo tipo, ahora mismo hay unas inversiones importantes para fortalecer la base antidrogas, hay más batallones creándose a lo largo del territorio para un departamento que solo tiene 150,000 habitantes. Pero lo que las comunidades piden es un ejército de agrónomos, un ejército de técnicos agropecuarios, un ejército que también esté en las corporaciones autónomas regionales para proteger los parques nacionales naturales y para proteger las reservas forestales que necesita conservar la Amazonía, el país y el mundo. Y entonces tenemos un Estado que no es el que se compadece con los pedidos y reclamos de las comunidades. Eso es para atender la pregunta de Tumi. Si hay Estado, no es como tú dices, este no es un país medieval, somos un país de renta media que ahora forma parte de la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económico. Tendríamos que ser prácticamente un país que no estuviera pidiendo cooperación internacional para el desarrollo, sino un país que estuviera antes brindándole cooperación a otros países que tienen una condición económica peor que la nuestra. Pero es un país con una inequidad absolutamente enorme. Somos el segundo país más desigual en la distribución de la tierra después de Haití en esta parte del mundo y somos como el tercero o cuarto en el mundo. Entonces, es un país que tiene plata, pero muy mal distribuida. Eso estuvo presente en el punto 1 del acuerdo de paz. Señalo, por ejemplo, que dice el profesor Tumi, ¿cuánto valdría esa presencia estatal a la que yo hago referencia? pues en el acuerdo se estableció que toca hacer barridos prediales, toca hacer inventarios prediales, toca levantar el catastro multipropósito y que la gente que no pague impuestos en este país los pague por primera vez. Grandes latifundios en este país no pagan impuestos. No se trata de ninguna manera de doblarle los impuestos a las poblaciones urbanas, sino que la gente pague lo justo por sus propiedades. En regiones como el Meta, el Casanare, el Guaviare, Arauca, Bichada, la gente en su gran mayoría dueña del latifundio no paga los impuestos que le correspondería pagar. Eso debe hacerse de manera prioritaria en programas como el del catastro multipropósito. Y adicionalmente, el poder en este país está muy concentrado en Bogotá. Lo decía una vez el expresidente César Gaviria, no hay ningún alcalde o gobernador que quiera en Colombia emprender un gran proyecto de infraestructura sin primero pasar por Bogotá, pedir permiso y a poner el sombrero. ¿Por qué? Porque aunque la Constitución Política de Colombia habla de descentralización, este país todavía no está descentralizado. Hay que fortalecer a las alcaldías y darles a ellas más capacidades. Miren que en el programa de consolidación se le terminó entregando a las fuerzas militares recursos para hacer inversión en carreteras cuando eso es una obligación de las autoridades civiles democráticamente elegidas. En desmedro de la militarización de las democracias y de la vida de las comunidades, lo que hay que hacer es fortalecer el poder civil de autoridades locales democráticamente elegidas por las comunidades y también fortalecer a las organizaciones comunitarias, cooperativas, asociaciones de productores que quieren dejar atrás la dependencia de ingresos ilícitos. Y por último, aunque no quisiera referirme a eso para no generar polémica, pero alguien escribió que mi postura favorece a los narcotraficantes. Déjenme decirles, porque creo que es una afirmación bastante irresponsable, que en Colombia lamentablemente siguen viéndose las cosas del debate sobre política de drogas en blanco y negro. Entonces, quienes cuestionan las políticas públicas existentes que hacen hincapié en el uso de la fuerza son señalados como amigos de los ilegales y esto no puede seguir siendo así. Mi postura es la misma hoy que la que tuve a principios de los años 90 cuando empezamos nuestra oposición a la erradicación forzada. Hemos dicho hasta la saciedad que el uso de la fuerza no funciona con las comunidades, que los programas de sustitución voluntario, concertado, implican una estrategia más pacífica donde no se disparan tiros, donde la comunidad se vincula a estos programas de desarrollo, deja atrás la dependencia de esos ingresos de manera absolutamente tranquila, sin necesidad de meter preso absolutamente a nadie. Y por último, decirles que muchas de las afirmaciones que yo estoy haciendo acá, las he hecho en otros foros, pero también las han sostenido gobiernos. Por ejemplo, el Consejo Nacional de Estupefacientes de Colombia en el año 2013 dijo que las estrategias de persecución de los cultivos y de los cultivadores no brindan ningún resultado estable y no funcionan en la guerra contra drogas, mientras que probablemente la destrucción de infraestructuras de cristalizaderos de cocaína, las grandes infraestructuras de procesamiento y de transporte y de embarque de la cocaína para el mundo, eso es lo que debe perseguirse. Incluso la Comisión de Drogas del Hemisferio Occidental del Congreso de los Estados Unidos dijo, no se está haciendo mayor cosa en la lucha contra el lavado de activos. Buena parte de los recursos del lavado se incorporan a la economía colombiana y terminan incluso deteriorando la democracia porque terminan financiando campañas electorales y destruyendo lo poco que hemos avanzado en materia de democracia. Incluso buena parte del lavado de activos ha terminado en una contrarreforma agraria que termina afectando los intereses de los pueblos indígenas, afrodescendientes y campesinos. Entonces, no son afirmaciones exclusivas mías, sino que hay evidencia sobre lo que hemos estado afirmando. Disculpen que me extendí, Renata, pero me parece importante responder eso.
No, muchas gracias, Pedro. Claro que sí. Beth, you want to take the floor?
Sure. I mean, I honestly don't have a huge amount to add because I think that captured a lot of the dynamics. I'll just make a couple of points. Look, I mean, I think there's a question in the queue as well about sort of how, and I wanted to add to what Adam mentioned before about how the Biden administration could start to make a change. And I think when we look at some of the officials that are coming in, I think one of the concerns is that if you look at, you know, the concern is, oh, well, this person in the past supported eradication, this person in the past supported fumigation. The truth is that every US official has supported this policy because it's the only policy. And so I think this is a little bit of the conundrum that we're finding ourselves in is because we want to, you know, limit the drug supply coming into the US, we have to look at the tools that are available. And for a long time, the only tools have been eradication and fumigation. We now have, though, an example from the peace accord of substitution happening in a way that I think this is really important to point out. When the substitution program began and communities agreed to give up their coca, They ripped it up themselves, largely without any violence at all. So this was a non-violent eradication that was voluntary, that was agreed upon, and that happened in a way that actually reinforced peace rather than undermining it. So, I think we just have to sort of expand our horizon a little bit. And again, think about not only the short-term costs, but the long-term costs. It's not an easy calculation, and these are not easy calls to make. But again, we have an example now that we can hold up as a sort of a counter narrative to move forward. Look, with regard to the political polarization, I think, as Pedro mentioned, first of all, it creates a lot of black and whites that are really unuseful, really unhelpful. But I think, again, Crisis Group being a pragmatic organization, our position would be that we also have to recognize the things that are working. I think the PDETs, these are the programs for development with a territorial focus under the peace agreement. This is something that I think we should get behind, right? These are potential initiatives that have a transformative possible impact in the rural areas, because they bring the resources that are needed for some of these interventions. For example, the development of roads, infrastructure, and they were developed largely in consultation with communities where they're being implemented. So again, I think rather than looking at polarization as something that's a roadblock, we can also think about trying to find common spaces and places where there is agreement about how to move forward. I'll just make one final point, which is that I think there is a lot of space to improve, particularly looking at the way that security is attacked from sort of up the supply chain. So looking, for example, at money laundering, Colombia's infrastructure for addressing money laundering is extremely limited. And it's actually significantly behind other countries of the same income level. So I would say that, there are areas to focus. There are things to be done. There are clear interventions to be had in terms of making transactions more visible, drawing them to the attention of the central bank, and bringing up to speed that sort of intervention that can actually have a very, a longer term effect and disarticulating these armed groups than constantly going after sort of the raw material that they're benefiting from.
Thanks, Beth. And as we pointed in the report, there's a number of criminal economies besides Coca that also fuel the war, right? There's like illegal gold, timber, et cetera, et cetera. Adam, I'm going to turn to you, and I am going to just add a quick question because I don't think we're going to have time for a second round that Sandra Tree is posing in the Q&A, which is, what is your impression about Ambassador Brian Nichols being named for the Western Hemisphere at State Department, considering that he in the past had been applauding the Peru eradication? So what do you think if he is appointed, if he's named, confirmed for this post, what do you think that would mean for the Biden government position in all of this?
I'll start with that. I would never put Brian Nichols in the category of an inveterate drug warrior. He, as Liz said, the eradication was the tool. I mean, that was the policy. And he did go on record a few times praising Peru for its manual eradication program, which is certainly not as militarized as Colombia's, I would say. But still, I mean, he was definitely in favor of it. I do, my impression, I knew Brian Nichols when he was the #2 at the U.S. Embassy in Colombia in the late 2000s, at the very height of the National Territorial Consolidation Plan that I talked about. And my impression of him was that he was actually very interested in that getting state presence into ungoverned areas framework. So I think he would lean more in that direction. But again, I'm imputing views and motives to somebody I actually haven't even spoken to for years. So take that. On that statelessness thing, I just want to address it a bit because there were a lot of questions about it. What do we mean by statelessness? I think Pedro addressed that pretty well, where you really just see the occasional military patrol. And Pedro was the mayor of a municipality or county in Colombia that is the size of Connecticut. And when you left the town center, you would go a certain number of miles on the road and you'd hit the last military checkpoint. And after that, I don't even know what condition the road was in. And you certainly would never see police. And maybe you'd see an occasional military patrol. And as you got further out, people would grow coca out in the open with no fear of ever running into the state. And, I've never seen this, but I've seen lots of photos of it. You eventually hit towns where the stores, instead of having a cash register, have a little scale on the counter and you pay with coca paste because it's just easier than trying to get your hands on currency. That's statelessness. And so we're talking about the myth of statelessness. Yeah, that's true. You'll see guerrilla graffiti. You'll see there's clearly some authority you can go to if you have a dispute that's not the state. So in that sense, it's not completely stateless, but this is what we mean. And then I've seen some in the Q&A, some real skepticism about whether we can ever even, Colombia can ever really do anything about it, or if it even wants to do about it, anything about it. You know, I still maintain some personally, and I don't know if I could even explain why, but I maintain some confidence that Colombia's political and institutional process can break with this history of not governing the countryside and distributing resources. I still think that we can do this through the political process in Colombia without a huge revolution. If I'm wrong, then, you know, what's the point? You're always going to have cocaine in the countryside, coca and cocaine in the countryside, unless you legalize and regulate coca and cocaine, and then it'll be grown around the airport in Bogota, where it's, you know, you don't have as many shipping problems. If you did that, if you did suddenly, if you left the countryside ungoverned, but cocaine was suddenly not a source of income for organized crime, you wouldn't have a golden age of peace and prosperity in the Colombia's ungoverned countryside. You'd have to deal with all the other violent aspects of leaving vast areas stateless. You know, you'd still have, as the report notes well, illicit mining, timber, just plain control of extortion of every business that exists, human trafficking. If you're near a border, like in Arauca, which I was talking about, taxing contraband. That's how the ELN in Arauca makes much more money by extorting the oil industry and everything that goes along with it. As well as state coffers and royalties. They haven't had to depend on the coca in Arauca, in an area where they've been since the early 1980s. And they actually pretty much prohibited farmers from planting coca, which put them in a dispute with the FARC and later now with FARC dissidents. But that's still the rule there. So you do have a very violent place that doesn't have much coca. Now you also have violence in Colombia over just land tenure or mega projects. If somebody wants your land because they want to have a big cattle ranch or African oil palm plantation or to build a dam, you're going to face violence, coca or not. So, you know, there are places as well where there's coca without violence, at least for brief times. I mean, Putumayo in the 2010s until recently, when the FARC had a dominion and then when the FARC demobilized, was quite peaceful for much of the 2010s. Relatively, it certainly wasn't, you know, it wasn't, you know, Massachusetts, but it was certainly less violent than it is now. Even Catatumbo, when the three guerrilla groups there had a sort of arrangement that has long since broken down, there was a period of relative peace. Never a paradise of law and order, but, you know, and super unstable. It always falls apart, but you can have peace with coca. But often when you see an increase in coca growing, it does seem to mean that there is an increase in competition and disputes with armed groups and new armed groups showing up. So I'll leave those thoughts.
Thanks so much. John, why don't I turn to you to the question on reduction of consumption policies and just your take from the drug policy angle.
Sure. You know, I think it makes sense to think of how major consuming countries might be able to lower their own demand over time in a way that could reduce the draw for and sort of the magnet for cocaine production. But I think we need to take that in context. I mean, just don't hold your breath would be my response. Markets tend to wax and wane, but what is clear over these, you know, I referred at the outset to the decades-long effort here. Essentially, the global cocaine market is long installed in many countries. So it's not just the sort of global north of the United States anymore. Brazil, for instance, in Latin America, is a major consumer. European countries. So it's a global market in a globalized world. It's not going to go away. And I think we need to put in context Colombia's role in this global market and understand what the structure of that market is in a system that's prohibitionist and provides these fantastic profits that actually nourish a black market and groups that are willing to operate outside the law, especially where the rule of law is so weak, to engage in that market. I think so that goes to a whole series of other questions about what kind of market it should be, what kind of steps should be taken to try to reduce the demand. Traditionally, in much of the world, those steps have been criminalizing use and possession, resulting in massive human rights abuses, due process violations, and mass incarceration. So there are a number of problems with the global approaches over the last 5 or 6 decades that need to be addressed. So it's not just, well, if only they would do the right thing, because I think there's two false dichotomies. One, Colombia can solve the world's cocaine problem. And two, even a very different system, as Adam was pointing to, of legal regulation of cocaine in this case, will solve Colombia's problems. Both of those are false. Both of those are false narratives. But it's clear that prohibition and its enforcement and the escalation of criminalization and repression is the worst of both worlds, right? So I think what should be on the table when we think of a more global debate and shared responsibility, which is supposedly what the UN system is supposed to bring to this, is putting the entire range of options on the table, realizing that the quick fix, cheap shortcut solutions haven't worked and never will work, and have a more sober understanding of what the options are, including what would legal regulation of these markets entail for not just Colombia, but for other states, and begin a more sound debate based on the evidence of the failure of prohibition and its escalation and criminalization, and an assessment of the risk in managing markets that will be with us for good.
Thanks so much, John. And I think in relationship with that, we need to acknowledge that there are some politicians that in Colombia are starting to talk about regulation of the cocaine market for the first time. Iván Marulanda has a project in Congress and such for the first time. It's obviously, I think everybody understands that Colombia won't be able to do this alone, that this is something that requires international coordination. And perhaps with that, I just turn to Ivan to answer that question, but perhaps give us your last closing thoughts before we say goodbye. I know there are pending questions remaining in the Q&A, and this is obviously a topic that we could talk about for a long time. So I apologize, but this will be the last intervention.
Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you very much, all of you. Just a brief response to the question first, which has been posed about international responses. I mean, let's bear in mind that Latin American leaders, a lot of them former political leaders, have actually led the effort to make international drug policy respond more to concerns about public health and human rights. And obviously this led to the UN General Assembly special session in 2016, where again Latin American countries were at the forefront of trying to recast drug policy, and it wasn't particularly successful. There is a lot of resistance in a number of countries, large emerging economies, countries in Asia, countries in the Middle East, which are very opposed to any relaxation in drug policy, and that was made very evident. At the same time, what can the international community do? I can just think of, two things which would be very relevant to Colombia. I think obviously the attention given to all those rural reforms, which Beth, which Pedro have been speaking about, the support which the EU and the US have given to them, is something which should continue. I mean, not just in the terms of money alone, but in terms of thinking, how do you link Colombia's vast rural areas to the global economy in the most efficient way possible, in a way which will get money into the pockets of farmers and not just in the hands of distributors and logistical chains. And that's something which requires incredibly close attention of the sort which I don't think has been given necessarily in Colombia over the last few years. And secondly, let's look back to what happened at the end of 2016, when the peace accord was struggling towards being signed by all sides and being ratified. At the same time, obviously, Donald Trump had been elected, and there was a Coca boom underway, which had begun because a lot of farmers realized that there would be material rewards for substituting their crops. Now, in those years, Colombia was confiscating, seizing huge amounts of cocaine. I believe the figure now is that cocaine is responsible for Colombia is responsible for 35% of seizures worldwide. But that wasn't enough. I mean, the pressure from the Trump administration was immediately eradicate. The pressure from voices in Colombian society was eradicate. There wasn't that margin of patience with what Colombia was trying to do at that time. And all I would say is, if there's going to be a change in policy, there has to be a certain amount of strategic patience from the international community to whatever happens in Colombia in the sight, in the hope that there will be a longer term change. That was my response to the question, Renata. I would just want to say, in my closing words.
Actually, Pedro is asking me to address one question that he would like to respond before we close.
Jump in, Pedro, please.
Pedro, querías contestar la pregunta sobre las protestas cocaleras y la protección de líderes sociales. Dale.
Sí, porque ha habido, digamos, unas afirmaciones en el blog, en el chat, pero también porque este tema ha aparecido en las presentaciones. Es un tema muy sensible actualmente. En el informe del Departamento de Estado que certifica los esfuerzos de lucha contra drogas en Colombia, se señala que el año inmediatamente anterior, Colombia sufrió un crecimiento exponencial de las protestas campesinas cocaleras en contra de la erradicación forzada terrestre, y que esto es uno de los factores que más impide el éxito de las operaciones de erradicación. Probablemente si no hubieran existido estas protestas, entonces no hubiéramos tenido 130.000 hectáreas erradicadas, sino quizás se hubieran erradicado todas las hectáreas en un solo año existentes en Colombia. Pero ahí habría mucho que decir ya sobre la efectividad y las cifras que han sido presentadas por el Ministerio de Defensa. Pero quiero referirme exclusivamente a que se hace muy mal desde los medios de comunicación y desde los oficiales de gobierno cuando asimilan las protestas cocaleras a protestas de criminales. Realmente las protestas campesinas cocaleras son protestas de campesinos agricultores inconformes con la erradicación, que reclaman en primer lugar, como sucedió ayer en el municipio de Sardinata, en el norte de Santander, que llegue el programa de sustitución de cultivos. La Corte Constitucional colombiana señaló una secuencia correcta, que es la misma de las directrices internacionales para el desarrollo alternativo, que dice, primero hay que ofertarle a esas comunidades la oportunidad de ingresar a un programa de sustitución. Solo si no se puede implementar un programa de sustitución, se podría hacer erradicación forzada terrestre. Y como última instancia, se podrían hacer aspersiones aéreas. Nos parece muy mal que incluso desde la sección de narcóticos de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en Bogotá, se esté planteando en algunos documentos una coincidencia de las manifestaciones campesinas en contra de la erradicación con intereses de grupos criminales. ¿Por qué? Porque esto significa una nueva estigmatización y criminalización de los liderazgos campesinos que se oponen a la erradicación y que reclaman sustitución. Y recordemos que estamos hablando de un país en el que los líderes y lideresas sociales están llevando la peor parte después del acuerdo de paz. Un número muy alto está siendo asesinado constantemente, sufriendo amenazas, teniendo que desplazarse desde sus lugares de origen, justamente por esa estigmatización, esa criminalización. Probablemente entonces tendríamos después un escenario de judicialización de esos liderazgos. Y eso para nada es serio en un país que se dice democrático, que además tiene consagrado en su constitución el derecho a la protesta social.
Gracias, Pedro. Sí, un punto importante. Ahora sí.
Well, now, thank you so much. I mean, for me, this has been a really wonderful discussion on a very tricky subject, and I'm sure there are going to be more discussions in the future on this very issue. Thank you to WOLA, thank you to Viso Mutop, thank you to everyone who's been involved in this, all of you for attending. I just want to, walk away with give you a last thought or two before we finish. I think one of the tropes, if you like, one of the common ways of understanding policies against the drug industry, the narcotic industry, is of the balloon effect, or sometimes also called the cockroach effect. You do something, the problem is just pushed elsewhere. And we're not talking in the report which Crisis Group produced about the whole drug industry. We're talking about its roots. We're talking about the farms. We're talking about where the coca leaves come from, this indispensable input into the sort of production process of cocaine. There, the economic incentives exist as well, very clearly made. This point has been very clearly made by Beth and Pedro. But the policy has just pushed production to the most remote areas of Colombia. We haven't shown a map of where coca is grown nowadays in Colombia, but you can see very clearly Nariño and Norte de Santander, two of the hot spots of the moment, right against the Ecuadorian border, right against the Venezuelan border, in huge concentrations of crops. So, that more eradication leads to ever more growth of coca in more remote areas. So eradication is, as Adam has said, short-term thinking, understandable short-term thinking? What else exists? What would be long-term thinking? How would it work? What would be involved? What would the stakes be? How much money would it cost? But there's also the sense of short-term thinking endlessly being repeated over time. And this is something which we see not just in, you know, the counter-narcotic fight in Colombia, it's the counter-narcotic fight in Mexico, it's elsewhere as well. So no clear solutions. We don't say there are any. I agree with many of the policies which are being suggested. I think it involves changes in rural policy, changes in rural economic development, and changes in security policy. And at a certain moment, it will require the international community to sit down and say, really, well, what is the most effective way of doing this? And that will require leadership. And we're waiting to see if that will happen or not. But in the meantime, thank you so much. We will continue writing about this, and I hope you continue to plug into all our reports from all the organizations involved here. Thank you.
Y naturalmente les invitamos a los que no hayan tenido la oportunidad de leer nuestro informe de Crisis Group sobre este tema, lo encuentran en nuestra página crisisgroup.org. Y quiero antes de terminar darle las gracias a Charlie Roberts, nuestro maravilloso intérprete. La tarea más difícil de todas es interpretar conversaciones en vivo. Entonces, mil gracias a Charlie y a todos ustedes. Nuestros emails están en el website. Cualquier pregunta, muy contentos de seguir la conversación vía Twitter, en privado, como la prefieran. Mil gracias a todos y mil gracias de nuevo a Adam y John y a WOLA, a Matthew, que fue el que organizó todo esto en WOLA, que sin él no estamos aquí, Natasha, nuestra coordinadora, Victoria, nuestra intern. Mil gracias a todos. Que tengan buena tarde y feliz fin de semana.
Gracias, Renata.
Thank you, everybody. Gracias, Renata.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Gracias.